Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, and thank you for your time. The clock is ticking right away, so we're going to get straight into it. We're here to talk about compliance solutions in this space, and I don't know if Him Das raised this in his remarks earlier, but we're actually 10 years and 2 weeks just past the anniversary of FinCENs guidance in the virtual currency space, which actually set off quite a bit in terms of discussions with this industry about what compliance meant and what you were all supposed to do. And I do remember in some of those discussions 10 years ago being with people from this industry who were very concerned about what this all meant and saying, this compliance stuff is very hard. Do you really expect us to do this? And my response, and others' response at the time was, you're smart enough to come up with these great ideas and these great solutions in this space. You're going to be smart enough to come up with compliance solutions as well. And I think 10 years later, we've actually seen that. We've got a group of people up here on the stage who are focused on it and who are making great strides. There are still things that need to be done. At the same time, I think that people need to recognize that where there were challenges, there were opportunities, and people continue to take advantage of those opportunities. So with me, I'll just say very quickly, the group, we've got Katherine from Bitwise. She is their GC and Chief Compliance Officer and part of their executive management team. But importantly, she's also been a former federal prosecutor in the Northern District of California, focusing on financial crimes issues. We have Marina, Chief Executive Officer, CEO from Crystal Blockchain Analytics. They provide services to banks, FIs, governmental organizations, and payment solutions. And she's also a seasoned entrepreneur in digital finance and asset management, not just on the technical side. Erin joins us from Binance, where she's been there for 4 years, and she's the head of intelligence and investigations. And while she may not be, she always said she's not a compliance expert, but what I call her is she's a why we have compliance expert, so we'll be hearing from her. And then Lana Schwartzman, head of regulatory and compliance at Notabene. She's new to Notabene, but not new to this compliance, and she's had similar roles at other companies and include in the consulting space. So I'm going to pose the first question to a group of you, and our idea is to jump in and just have a conversation about this topic. And we talked about this earlier, but compliance solution providers need to keep pace not only with regulatory change, but the pace at which criminals adapt to continue to perpetrate their crimes. So Erin, Lana, and Marina, what new criminal typologies are emerging in 2023? How are solution providers addressing them? What are you doing now that you weren't doing 12 years ago, and what do you expect you might be doing 12 months from last year? And what might you be doing next year? And then as you talk about this, we've had a couple of enforcement cases related to CoinEx out of New York, Kraken, OFAC, and Bittrex, a FinCEN and OFAC thing. We could work that in as well. But Marina, why don't you kick us off with that? It's a lot.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, ever since I joined cryptocurrency industry, I have seen that it's kind of a race happening between the illicit actors and the solutions that are supposed to be finding and identifying these illicit activity. It's very hard to develop these kind of solutions because you not only have to keep up with the pace of development of the blockchains itself, to consider the complexity of the space, and to cover the old school methods of scam and Ponzi schemes, but also keep up with everything that comes up right now. And it develops super fast. Just give you an example, with the recent hype of generative AI, in the last months, we have seen an incredible increase of the white papers for new scam and Ponzi projects, that are to flood our market, I expect, in the next months from now, because they are right now being in preparation, and some of them already hit the market. So that's just a tiny example, which also would bring additional load on the law enforcement processing these requests in 2023. Not to mention, of course, that the illicit actors themselves, I see them becoming much more mature sure. For example, mixers are becoming an instrument of amateurs right now. The more complicated schemes include confronting and creation of additional, multiple entities that were created years ago, to prepare for a certain situation at this moment, and also involving nested services, which are a big problem right now, where the virtual asset service providers who don't have any license or any requirements for KYC are using the infrastructure of a bigger exchanges who are willing to provide those. So yeah, that's just a few the name of those that just became very visible in the last 12 months. The old school scam and Ponzi schemes and hackers are not going anywhere, and also just becoming more proficient. So yeah, it's exponentially increasing complexity. Yeah.
So Erin, from where you're sitting, what are you seeing in terms of some of the changes and challenges in terms of what you're focused on?
Yeah, so just to start, I think it's important to note Binance has really invested in the last 12 months, the last few years, in really expanding and ramping up our compliance programs. I think last year alone we responded to over 27,000 law enforcement requests. We have over 750 employees in sort of compliance and security and anti-fraud roles. And we've really expanded, in my case, our investigations team. We've brought on experts from law enforcement agencies and blockchain analytics companies from around the world, and we're really focused on sort of building that global knowledge base internally. And I think that's really kind of an important kind of dichotomy to highlight. We talk about investigating crypto crime or crime using cryptocurrency. Blockchain tracing is sort of an art and a science. So there's really the technical component where you have these amazing technologies coming out that can really help with these sort of fin crimes or compliance investigations. But then you also, I think part of the way that we kind of keep up with what's going on is really investing in people and knowledge and sort of those experts that can really take the technology but then interpret it correctly and really go above and beyond to sort of provide those key insights in what we're seeing. And I think a really interesting point, a couple of recent examples we've had where that might be, finally illustrated. We had a case that we assisted with out of Brazil, a kidnapping case, and we traced Bitcoin through, I think it was Samurai Wallet, through their kind of privacy services, and actually were able to identify the suspects due to the sort of both the technical capabilities of the tools we use, but then also the ability to interpret that by our team. And then I think another sort of really good example is, again, actually with our cooperation with the Brazilian Federal Police, we've kind of really worked to knowledge share and sort of build off of our own capacity. And a lot of these agencies we work with don't necessarily have access to all the tools that we have or the really expensive sort of solutions, but they're able to use open source information, the sort of inherently transparent nature of the blockchain, to really advance their investigations and find solutions.
So we had Himdas speak earlier, and we had another panel, and you can see a little bit of juxtaposition there in terms of him focusing on compliance, enforcement, working with industry, and others who basically say that there are so many resources that are being focused on compliance, it's potentially choking. Now, you're all involved in that. I mean, Lana, from your perspective, what's the purpose of all of this compliance, and how does that affect what you're doing at Notabene?
Sure. We as a company, we stand for the ability to finally be able to have the pre-transaction transparency that the ecosystem needs so much when it comes to travel rule compliance. We, for example, just completed our second annual State of Travel Rule report, and we had found that 84% of our respondents answered that they're at least at some level of compliance when it comes to travel rule, or will be by the end of this year. And internally, we've seen metrics that show that in the past 12 months, there has been over 50x growth when it comes to travel rule volume. So something some people think, excuse me, that travel rule is a check the box kind of an exercise, right? But really, those are the ones that are missing the point, because we have to remember that with travel rule, it's not just about sending the originator and the beneficiary information securely. You know, as I mentioned, it is about identifying and stopping this high-risk activity before it occurs. And it's so important that, let me repeat that just one more time, right? That now, for once, we have the ability to stop an illicit transaction before it occurs on the blockchain. And I think that's next level revolutionary compliance measures and controls.
So that is, there's a lot of focus on the travel rule, and we're glad that you're on the panel. One of the things, I mentioned a couple of the enforcement cases, or basically the anti-money laundering and sanctions cases. And one of the things that we're seeing when those penalties come out is that there is a penalty imposed, but then in a couple of cases, Kraken and Coinbase in particular, there is an agreement that they're going to spend money and invest in compliance. That's a double-edged sword for me, in terms of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Lana, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about how you guys fit into the compliance space. But while you're doing that, I want everybody to think about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that they now have to show they're spending money on compliance. Will they just be throwing money at it, or of course it's good for business, but there are pros and cons to that. But tell us a little bit about where Bitwise fits in within the compliance space.
Sure, Jamal. So at Bitwise, we're a little bit on a different side of the spectrum than Erin at Binance and service providers. We have a crypto asset product. So we're kind of lucky from an AML standpoint because we have subscribers to our funds and our private funds. So we're being given information about the investors coming in, and we work with our banks, and we're constantly looking at new technology to help keep ahead. As you were saying, Marina, it just gets more and more complex. So we red flag, and we can look at each of the investors coming in before we allow them to subscribe to our funds. On our multi-strategy fund of funds, hedge fund side, we spend a lot more time in that space making sure that everything's copacetic, right? So I'm on the side of not trying to choke with compliance, as some of the panelists were saying earlier, but reaching that institutional caliber approach to counterparty risk, making sure that the monies that you're taking are safe and that they're not falling afoul of federal regulations at a time now where we are at such a crossroads in this industry of really needing to create that trust. And I think the more individual players in this environment that we're in right now can show that we are doing what we can, and that what you were telling your clients years ago, you're smart enough to come up with the innovation, be smart enough to come up with the tools that strike a good balance between following the law and spending an efficient amount of time doing it. So not choking yourself. If you're feeling choked, have a further conversation and figure out ways to do it in a more efficient way, and some of the tools that are out there to do it. At the same time, if we're feeling that choke, there's some validity to that, because we are being fitted into a TradFi system that grew up with money laundering, that grew up in the 80s, where the bad guys were the drug traffickers, and definitions got expanded to take control of those types of behaviors. We don't want to replace the drug dealers and the traffickers as the bad guys. So we need to replace that headline risk with some of the rewards of the technology and show how we're doing this and how we're combating the complexities that are out there, and that we're growing and evolving with the industry. At the same time, we do need to continue to work with the regulators to show them where it doesn't make sense, because there's a big difference between can't and won't, right? So we need to continue to have that conversation evolve, so we end up with the right regulations. I call them the Goldilocks regulations. We haven't gotten there yet. It's part of a process, and I think we need to all be part of that. And we've heard from some regulators today who have invited that conversation. and we need to hold them to it, because I think we've all experienced some areas where that invitation isn't real, and we've experienced other areas where it is real, and we need to press upon making that real, because if we don't have that knowledge share, then we're not going to get further and evolve and push the regulation to where it needs to be, or the courts, et cetera. So that's my stance.
So that's great. I'm going to jump off of that, with the others. Have you, thinking about that whole notion of forced spend, how are you dealing with that? And do you feel that regulators actually know, Lana and Marina, what your product actually is and what it does?
Well, yeah, we have supervisory authorities among our customers and private companies, so we understand that we are this important bridge between public and private sector, and they both look at the same data, but do they make same conclusions out of this data? That's a big question. And also, like, how do they structure their processes around these data? And to your point about the unnecessary or like forced spend on the compliance, the situation that I see frequently is that every new typology of criminal activity, every new kind of algorithm that we bring in, every new blockchain that we support raises up number of the alerts on the customer side that are not necessarily connected to any like illicit activity. So they're technically considered to be false positives. And the amount of these false positives are, it just creates enormous additional load on our customer. So this is like also a big question to data providers and the service providers, like, are we creating, this load, understanding that, it's false positives, or are we protecting our customers from overspending and reallocating these resources to something, much more meaningful? So yeah, that's a challenge that's in front of every service provider looking at blockchain and analyzing blockchain these days.
Yeah, I think that the issue is you're focusing on not a number for spend, but just making sure that it's spent the right way, that it works. And I've seen traditional financial sector go down the path where to show that they're getting things done, they just are throwing resources at it and say, see, I've thrown the resources at it. But that's not the long-term solution. We have 50 seconds left. I asked you all to think of some buzzwords that you would hear people talking about over the next year. Lana, we'll start with you and we'll go down really quickly. Any buzzwords that that you predict you'll be hearing more of?
Trust.
Trust?
Yep.
Safety, regulatory clarity.
Okay. Marina?
Prediction and collaboration.
Okay. Erin?
Yeah, I was going to say collaboration or education.
Yeah.
Okay, and I was going to say, you're going to hear a lot about digital ID. You're going to hear a lot about geolocation software, some additional compliance tools, and then you're hearing a lot about crypto winter right now, but I actually think that in terms of innovation in the blockchain space, what we're going through now is actually a crypto spring, or we will see a crypto spring in terms of new innovations. So with that, we're 10 seconds over, and thank you all very much.